God uses hard things. God uses hard things to make us into loving people. In 1914, a British explorer named Ernest Shackleton took a crew of 27 men and set off for the South Pole in a ship called the Endurance. Their goal was to be the first humans in history to hike across the continent of Antarctica. You may wonder, did they make it? Not even close, because something goes really wrong. Antarctica that year was experiencing even colder weather than its usual tundra, if you can imagine that. And before the explorers even set foot on the coast of Antarctica, the sea freezes over. So there they are, stuck in a ship, stuck in the ice, stuck at the bottom of the world. Do you want to know for how long? 2 years. And as if it can't get any worse, what happens, of course, in Antarctica is something called the polar night, where for about 2 months of the year, the sun does not even come up. And this is famous for driving explorers insane, literally killing them because of the strange insanity that sets in over such a long period of darkness. This story of this crew is told in a book by the ship's name. It's called Endurance. Some of you might have read it. All of you should read it, because what happens is not only does every single man survive this journey, but they actually do something that I think is way more incredible. They become friends. And the diaries of their lives at the bottom of the world and their impossible journey out tells a story that becomes one of the most incredible and remarkable triumphs in human history, showing us that in the most bleak and dangerous of circumstances, people can not only endure, they can create character and thrive. Now, there's an incredible parallel to our year of pandemic. And what I want to suggest to you is that whether a crisis drives you insane or gives you an opportunity to create character depends on the habits you fall back on during the crisis. Some of the most fascinating and inspiring parts of the story of the sailors on the Endurance are how the men on this ship cling to inward habits of reading and journaling as acts of self-reflection. There are times, in fact, during their eventual hike out across the icebergs, where they opt to carry their diaries instead of more food because they realize that preserving their minds through self-reflection is as important, if not more, than preserving their bodies with food. But they also cling to these outward habits of friendship and community through meals, jokes, conversations, and more. And both these inward rhythms and these outward rhythms are crucial to building the endurance that leads to the character that gives rise to the hope of the survival that they indeed attain. Now, this is a stunning and historical example of the timeless but difficult truth that hard things make us into better people. God uses hard things to make us into people more capable of love, but it takes endurance. Consider this word with me for a moment, endurance. The idea of endurance is that we can hold up under hard things. Our English word for endurance actually has roots in both French and Latin, but both contain the idea of material hardening under something, resisting deterioration under difficulty. But in terms of character, the idea of endurance is not only that when circumstances push on you, do you have what it takes to push back on them, to stay strong, but also, do you have the humility to stay soft at the same time? That is the character that endurance gives rise to keep a strong mind, but a soft heart. And while these sailors are fascinating men, no life exemplifies the character of endurance more than the life of Jesus. Think about this idea of a strong mind under suffering in the story of Jesus. Our heroes are the kinds of people who can, even amidst the harshest circumstances, continue to see reality as it actually is. That's the strong mind. They cling to God's promises even when they don't seem to make sense of our immediate reality. This is Jesus in the desert. Though tired and hungry and thirsty and tempted, he still sees the words of God's promises so clearly, and he can recite them to the enemy. This is Jesus before the cross, sleepless and sweating blood, but he still says, your will, not mine. Jesus is the archetype of keeping a strong mind under suffering, but he is also the archetype of keeping a soft heart at the same time. We all know that in the midst of great trial, it is possible to endure simply by shutting yourself off to the world. And the people that do this may survive, but they survive bitter, hardened, alone. Not Jesus, who in the midst of horrible violence cried out, forgive them. In his deepest battles with evil and suffering, Jesus still saw that he was sent to love precisely those people who were the cause of his suffering. He was to die for those who persecuted him. Humbly, he did so. In the midst of his own polar night, Jesus keeps a soft heart. This is why when the book of Hebrews exhorts us to run the race of the Christian life with endurance, it tells us to look to Jesus, because Jesus is the character of endurance incarnate. He is endurance in the flesh. And this metaphor that Hebrew uses when it talks about endurance is instructive, because every reader of this Hebrews passage instinctually knows that running with endurance is the kind of thing that takes practice. It takes training. So the question for us, and the question of this video series, is how do you practice endurance? If it is true that God uses hard things to make us into more loving people, then how do we say, I will lean into enduring because I want to build the character of Christ. I want to cultivate the hope of Christ. I want to practice the love of Christ. In these next two videos, I'm going to talk about habits of endurance. And in keeping with the analogy of the sailors on the Endurance, I'm going to talk about building the inward and the outward habits of endurance. So in the next video, we'll talk about the inward rhythms of endurance. What rhythms do you need in your home and in your head to help steward yourself and your family into enduring through hard times? And then in the last video, we'll talk about outward rhythms of endurance. We'll talk about what does it look like to move outward into community and build rhythms of endurance together. But before we do any of that, let me pause and ask you to answer this question. So far, has your year hardened your heart, or has it made you a more loving person? I want you to take a couple minutes and discuss this with the group that you are watching this with. And discuss it honestly, but most importantly, discuss it in the context of this promise. The Savior who providentially uses crisis to expose who you really are is the same Savior who uses the same crisis to show you who He is. And He is also the same Savior who walks with you in your suffering, in that crisis, using endurance to form you into the new creation, the new character that He has called you to be. He is far too gracious to let you waste a crisis.